Hello and welcome to episode 35 of the Insider's Guide to Project Cars 2, where today we are going to be continuing our look at the race starts and be taking a look at the first corner and first lap mentality. Now we're going to look through a couple of various different scenarios of racing in online lobbies, both public and also in league racing, to get an idea of what you should and shouldn't be doing when it comes to the first corner and navigating your way through the pack on the first lap. So we'll take a look at this first scenario here. This was in a public lobby. I qualified myself round mid-pack as I wanted to put myself in and amongst it all. Now, using the same technique that we discussed in the previous episode, getting an okay launch off the line. My reaction to the green light was a little bit slow, and on the approach down to the first corner, we're going to dab the brakes before we actually get to the braking zone to make sure that the people behind are starting to get onto the brakes, and we're going to hold a tight line coming through the first turn and stay over to the right upon the exit. Now, coming down towards Eau Rouge, looking over to see where the car that is alongside me is actually positioned. There it is, popping up in the rear view mirror. So now I know that I'm safe and I don't have any cars either side of me. Just going to take it nice and easy coming through Eau Rouge and just purely focus on getting a decent exit and a decent run down towards the Com chicane. Now, as you probably saw, my run out of Rouge and out the top of Radion was alright, but not as good as this Nissan that's coming up behind and putting us into a 3-wide situation. Now, those two make contact, which gives me a little bit more room coming into the chicane itself, but I'm now having to go fairly cautious because the car in front of us has actually gone off and run a little bit deep. So I'm now actually biding my time and tucking back in behind the AMG and waiting for the next opportunity to pass, which is coming down here into the Brussels hairpin. Now, as you can see, go down the inside and hold a nice tight line on the inside to give him plenty of room, giving him a little bit of room on the exit, but also giving him a little bit of a squeeze to try and make it a little bit more difficult for him coming into the next corner. Now, as you can see, we're in a 3-wide situation again. I'm keeping well over to the right hand side to give the other cars plenty of room, but again they make contact. So now coming into P1, basically the focus is back on the car in front of us. He runs a little bit deep through the mid corner. I try to get up underneath him coming out through the exit, and then he gives me a slight pinch there on the approach to this corner, and I back out of it just to avoid making contact and try and settle in behind him. Again, he's a little bit squirrely through the first part. I get very sideways coming through the second part, which has gone and cost me a lot of momentum. Now, obviously, as you can see, looking in the rearview mirror to see where the car is behind and how close he actually is. Fortunately, he's a little bit further back, so I don't really have to worry about him, and I can just, now that I've got the space to myself, I can just focus on settling back down again and start to focus once more on this Aston Martin in front of us. Obviously, trying to get a decent run through Blanchimont, try not to run too wide on the exit, and try and see if we can close up in the braking zone for the bus stop chicane, which is this next chicane coming up now. Coming into the braking zone, nailing the braking point, shifting down the gears. The Aston Martin has gone deep and has run very wide there on the left hand side, giving him room through the second part of the bus stop chicane so he can rejoin back onto the circuit without making contact with me, and then completing the first lap. We have gone from 15th position up into 7th. That's a net gain of 8 places. Obviously, some of those were through mistakes of other people and crashes. There were a couple of overtakes that I had to make myself and capitalise on other people's mistakes and trying to get a decent run on them there. But we managed to survive the first lap with pretty much minimal contact. So what we're going to do now is actually take a look at this first lap once again from the replay and actually break it all down as to what I was actually doing, what I was actually thinking in the various different scenarios. So what we'll actually do now is take a look at the scenario once again, but from the chase cam in the replay mode, and basically break down the various different situations that unfolded through the lap and talking about some hints and tips and the reasons why I was doing certain things. So the actual race start itself, my launch off the line was okay, but not fantastic. It was a half decent start. As basically, reaction to the lights was a little bit slow, and as quite slow in actually releasing the clutch and getting rolling. That Audi that was there starting on our left hand side, front left in the picture, that is now kind of going up the inside or the middle of a couple of cars. He either jump started the race or he just got an absolutely fantastic launch off the line. BMW here on the right hand side, he's just wanting to get purely out of the way as much as possible, and he's going to go back to the back of the grid and basically pick up the pieces and try and avoid any carnage that ensues on this lap. Now, on the approach to turn 1 here at Spa, what I tend to do is tend to I like to stick to the very inside line and hug this inside wall here at Spa. Generally, it's the safest place to be, as it's a very, very tight hairpin. If you're in the middle of the track or you're on the outside, if someone's coming down the inside and misses their braking point and runs deep, there's quite a high chance that they're going to obviously run into the side of you and make contact. If I can get here on the inside, generally I can control the cars behind me and make them brake a little bit earlier and kind of control the speed coming down into this corner. Obviously, if there's a rammer or a griever behind me and his pure sole intention is just to try and take out as many cars as possible, he's not going to brake. But what I'll show you in a second is a little technique that I do to make the other cars slow down behind me and give myself as much room as possible behind and minimize that risk of contact. Now, coming down towards the first turn, what you tend to do, what you should be doing, is looking and finding and picking a lane. Now, what I mean by a lane is basically take your car's width and give yourself a bit of marginal room on either side, and then divide the width of the track into basically that amount of space. That what I'd class as possibly a lane, and as you can see here, I'm on the inside lane. The Mercedes AMG just here to my front left is kind of in the middle lane, and then to the right of him you kind of got the outside lane. Now, coming down towards the braking zone of the first turn, what you should be doing is finding a lane, getting into it, and then staying into it. Once you're about 50 to 30 odd meters before the actual braking point for the first turn, you want to be committed to a lane, and you shouldn't change direction. If you go ahead and change direction, other people are going to start moving around. That's when you start increasing the chances of there being crashes, contact, and damage being incurred on the first lap. If you are committing to a lane and staying in it, people will have a much better chance of reading your actions. There's a lot less movement going on and around coming into the approach of the first turn, and the risk of contact is going to be minimized. So I'm picking this inside lane. The Mercedes AMG there has got the middle lane, as you can see, and what I'm actually going to do is another technique now that I like to do on the approach to the first turn in order to try and slow the cars down behind me, which is as I come towards the braking zone, I'm not necessarily there in the braking zone yet, I go, whilst remaining full throttle, go ahead and lightly apply the brakes to bring on the brake lights. Now, people tend to react to brake lights when coming into the first corner, and they're not necessarily looking for the braking point. They're just looking at the cars in front, and they're looking for the brake lights coming on the cars ahead. So people tend to react to the brake lights, and obviously flashing them up early is going to make people be a little bit more cautious and start braking for the first turn a little bit earlier as well. So that's going to give me a little bit more room behind me and minimize the risk of making contact. So as you see there was a nice period where I was on the brakes, and if we jump to a couple of cars behind, so this is the car that was essentially the next in my lane behind me. As you can see, coming in, applying the brakes here, and he doesn't really react, but he can see, because he's got plenty of room between myself and him, he can actually afford to do that. But if he was a bit closer, he would have started braking a little bit earlier. Now, obviously, when it actually comes to the actual braking zone itself, that's when I start braking properly, and also brake whilst coming off the accelerator. And actually the Mercedes AMG that's there on my front left hasn't even started braking yet. He's actually missed his braking point, but there is quite a bit of room in front of us. But even still, I'm just trying to basically take it relatively cautious, give myself as much room as possible, and give myself the highest chance of surviving this first turn. So the Mercedes is now actually on the brake. I recognise that he is going to end up running deep and potentially run into the cars in front of me. So I'm going to be doing everything that I can to try and slow the car down as much as possible coming into this first turn. But fortunately, everyone kind of avoids making contact and ends up sticking to their lane, which is really, really good, because there's like minimal to no contact through the first turn in the immediate gaggle of the cars in front of us, and there was a slight little bit of lag there from one of the Mercedes. Now, with your lanes, when you're coming in, when you're using them coming into the first turn or first sequence of turns, You want to stay in your lane throughout the duration of the first turn or first sequence of corners. So what I'm actually doing here on the exit of the first turn is staying over to the right hand side and giving anyone else who's there on my outside as much room as possible, and giving myself as much room as possible to get a decent run coming out through the exit. Again, it's just something to do to avoid making contact with other drivers. Something like Monza with turn 1, and, well, should I say, yeah, turn 1, the first chicane at Monza. When you're coming into that, if you're there on the right hand side and you've got the inside for the first part of the Monza chicane, stay to the right hand side, coming through both the first part and also the second part, the left-hander. So stick to the outside for that second left-hander and leave that inside open. If you 100% know that there is no one there else on your inside, obviously you can go ahead and switch lanes and resume the normal racing line and take that apex curb. But if there is someone in and around lurking alongside you relatively close in proximity, it's usually best to just stay to your lane and basically hold it through those first sequence of turns. Likewise, if you're on the outside into turn 1 for Monza, you're going to have the inside for the second part of the left-hander of the Monza chicane. So stay to the outside for the first part. You then got the inside for the second part, and then give yourself a car whips on the exit of the chicane when accelerating away, just in case there is a car on the outside there. You avoid making contact that way, and you avoid getting tangled up and being spat off into the wall. So that is what I'm doing here. I'm sticking to my lane coming out through the exit. Now you can see the Mercedes AMG up in front of us has had a slight wiggle. That's why he's kind of swerving across the track. The NSX was a little bit wide coming out for the exit, and he's rejoining in a pretty safe, shallow angle and tucking right in behind that Lamborghini up ahead of us. Now at this point, as you remember, I was looking over to my left hand side trying to find out where this car was on my outside. It turned out to be a Nissan GTR GT3. And at this point I realised or recognised that he was now actually coming into my rear view mirror, so I actually knew where he was, and I was able to kind of resume my normal racing line on the run down towards Eau Rouge. So coming into here, I actually do another technique, or should I say do the same technique again coming into Eau Rouge here. As you can see, there are a ton of cars up in front of us. There is no real space to go for any overtaking opportunity. The cars in front of us are kind of lingering towards the middle. There's no real gaps or anything. So what I'm doing here is applying the brake a little bit and basically just trying to slow the cars down that are behind me to try and give myself as much room as possible to get a decent run coming through Eau Rouge and then out the top through Raidillon. Now actually coming into Eau Rouge itself, I'm actually braking at this point and shifting down into 4th gear, I believe I was. I believe I dropped it down into 4th. That is because of purely the amount of cars that are here in front of us. Obviously, if you've got no cars in front of you, you're going to have all the downforce and all the aerodynamic grip rolling over the top of the car and giving yourself the grip to carry the speed that you want and should be taking coming through Eau Rouge. It should be near enough flat out in the GT3 car if you've got it set up right. You may need to breathe a little bit on the throttle, just ease off it slightly as you come through the bottom part of Eau Rouge here, and obviously making sure that you get a nice line. But because there are a ton of cars up in front of us and they're all actually pretty close, there's going to be a lot disturbed there. I'm not going to get that aerodynamic grip that I would usually have if there was no cars or just a single car in front of me. So all the air in this area is completely disturbed. There's going to be very little aerodynamic grip, so I'm slowing myself down even more to actually make sure that I can actually get the run through Eau Rouge that I actually like. And as you can see, I'm here on a very, very good line. The NSX immediately there on my front left is running a little bit wide. The Lamborghini is starting to run out a little bit wide. So is the AMG and also the Ferrari as well. Ferrari's on a half decent line at the moment and actually maintains a decent line coming out through the top into Raidillon. But you can see that the Mercedes is actually now sliding out further out wide. But because I've had a decent run coming through and into Eau Rouge and giving myself a little bit of space, I'm actually trying to carry the momentum up through the top of Raidillon. Very, very close to cutting the inside there. just about lose contact with the white line, but it doesn't really matter too much. I believe the penalties for this lobby were actually turned off when it comes to the track limits. But yeah, giving myself the best run coming out on the top of Radion as possible to give myself and carry the momentum coming down the Kemmel Straight here to get alongside this NSX, which is what I'm now doing. Now the NSX actually goes ahead and moves over to the left hand side because the Nissan GT-R that is behind us is trying to make it into a 3 wide situation. The NSX is trying to prevent him from doing that, but the GT-R is pretty adamant on making this 3 wide and trying to carry the speed and momentum that he got on his run through Eau Rouge and Radion and continue it down here to try and pass both me and the NSX. Obviously I've recognised this. I'm hanging over to the right hand side of the track as you see, and as I continue to play out, the Nissan is fully committing, which isn't a wise idea. The NSX was making it relatively clear that he didn't want you passing down the outside, so what would have been best is to lift off and tuck in behind the NSX, but instead he tries to commit. He pretty much comes back onto the track. We're pretty much dead even when it comes to the 3 wide situation, but as he comes back onto the track he ends up making contact with the NSX, which then goes and turns the NSX and puts them both into the wall. So jumping back to me, obviously I was recognising there was a 3 wide situation. I was hanging over here on the right hand side for basically waiting for that moment when they were going to end up making contact and giving myself as much room as possible to try and reduce the risk of me getting caught up in the contact. And unfortunately for me, they do go off and spin off to the left, which gives me a ton of room on the outside. By this point, I recognise that they've gone and made contact and they've gone and speared off into the wall. So I'm now focusing again on the cars in front and basically just trying to settle in and see if I can close the gap up and to the cars in front of us. So taking my braking point slightly earlier because I'm so far over here on the right hand side. I can't really be bothered to try and open up this corner a little bit more. It's just going to compromise me a little bit more. I'm more just kind of focused on actually getting the car slowed down for this turn and actually getting in for the apex. Once again, the AMG GT3 is running a little bit wide, as are a number of cars up in front of us. And at this point, I switch from basically trying to close the gap, because I now have closed that gap, to being cautious and trying to avoid making contact. Obviously, the AMG is run out wide there on the curbs. He's going to rejoin back onto the track. I want to try and give him the room so he can do that and obviously not get caught up in his rejoin and take myself out of the race. So if you're going to try and avoid making as much contact as possible, try and give people room on the first lap, you're much more likely to survive it. So that's what I was doing here, and I've gone back to being cautious and just being patient, settled, tucked in behind the AMG here, as you can see, and just going to continue to follow him through the final part of the Lecombe chicane. Now he's obviously gone ahead and used the brakes a little bit, so I'm now having to slow down to avoid making contact. I believe there was a very, very slight touch here, but I didn't actually feel it, and his car didn't really kind of respond in any kind of negative manner either. So we got through that corner relatively nicely, and I'm now actually really, really close to the back of the Mercedes AMG, as you can see. And this next corner, the Brussels hairpin, actually is a relatively good overtaking opportunity if you can pop yourself here on the inside like I am doing and get your nose in alongside the car coming down in towards the first very early apex. Now, as you can see, I'm moving over to the right hand side to try and do that and actually putting myself into the mirrors of the Mercedes that is here on my left, and because of that he's obviously therefore thinking that I am going to be diving down the inside, and he's half thinking that he may have to give up the inside of the corner and give me room. Now, as you can see, the cars up in front of us are moving around as well. The Aston Martin that is up in front of this Lamborghini has actually moved over across and has gone defensive. It was there on the outside, as you can see, and the Lamborghini was kind of doing what I was doing and looking towards the inside, but then the Aston Martin moves across to try and block that, so the Lamborghini actually goes and moves back to the outside to retake the racing line. Now, this actually works fantastically in my favour, because there's now a lot more space between myself and the next car in the inside lane here, or well, yeah, this right hand lane as it were, just off the racing line. There's a lot more space between myself and him, which is going to give me more room to try and actually get my nose in down the inside of the Mercedes AMG, who's now got a more reduced amount of space now that the Lamborghini is going to move back over left and taking that space away from in front of him. Now the Merc once again goes and misses his braking point, runs relatively deep into the corner and actually ends up very far on the outside. I'm very much here on the apex, hugging the inside line, just like the Aston Martin is doing and the cars in front, and I'm now up alongside the Mercedes. So again, I've gone from being cautious to being a bit more aggressive, trying to make an overtaking opportunity happen. Now at this point, I know that the Mercedes is still there on my outside. I'm obviously trying to get a decent run coming out the exit of this, trying to consolidate actually taking this position away from the Mercedes, but also at the same time I'm having to be relatively cautious because that Lamborghini there on my front left is actually taking away my acceleration zone. I can't accelerate until he goes and accelerates, and we actually come very, very close, if I was to go to the bumper cam, to making contact with the Lamborghini, as you can see here. Get real close to the front of him, and that I just remember this camera's actually got a very, very wide field of view, which is why things look very, very stretched. But yeah, coming in very, very close to making contact, but there may have been a slight brush, but nothing that unsettled myself. I didn't feel any contact, and it didn't appear to unsettle the Lamborghini. Now, I knew that the Mercedes was still there on the outside. I didn't actually realise he was that far off the track. So what I'm doing here is trying to give him some room there on the exit. I was expecting him to basically be right up alongside my door with his wheels just inside the circuit and him kind of straddling over the curb. But instead he was actually way out wide. Didn't actually recognise that at the time. But either way, I tried to give him racing room on the exit there. And I'm going to try and give him racing room once again into this next left-hander because I know he's still there on the inside. There's no point on turning into a corner if you know there's a car on the inside because it's just going to end up in contact, and it's either going to end up with one of two of you spinning or both of you spinning, or if there's damage in the lobby then you may end up taking damage as well. So I'm giving racing room here on the inside, as you can see. Because of his line and his entry coming into the corner, where it was such a very tight and acute angle, his exit is going to be obviously a much wider line coming out for the exit here, and when he's trying to carry the speed through to try and hold and defend the position from me, he actually comes and runs, and we bang wheels. Fortunately for both of us, that doesn't really have too much of an effect. It just pushes me out a little bit wider. It didn't really have an impact. Obviously no damage was occurred, and neither of us spun, but we're now again in a three-wide situation. I've actually recognised this at this point. I realised that the Lamborghini has gone and moved over to the left-hand side, and I realised that the Mercedes is still very much there on my right-hand side. And if you remember from the clip, I was looking over to try and figure out where those two cars were and actually see how far alongside me they actually were, which is the reason why I ended up coming across onto the grass over here. It's because I wasn't quite looking where I was going and paying 100% attention to that. But fortunately, I rejoined the track, and it's at that point there that those two cars actually end up making contact and spearing off into the wall on the left-hand side. So that is another couple of positions gained. I've now got a whole load of space behind me as well. So I can go back to purely focusing on the cars in front and see if we can try and put the other guys under pressure and see if we can gain some more positions. Now coming into F.O.O.L here, the Aston Martin runs a little bit deep, as you can see, and is actually sliding out wide. I've recognised this and actually trying to cut back underneath him and kind of get there, but not quite. He's giving me the racing room at this point, but I'm also very much aware that he is there on the outside and is basically taking away the acceleration zone. I'm kind of having to breathe on the throttle a little bit and put a fair bit more steering input in to basically avoid making contact with him running out too far wide. As you can see, the Lamborghini up in front of us has lost traction on the rear end and is spinning off into the wall on the left hand side. Recognise that. Fortunately, the wall doesn't bounce him back across the circuit and it stays there onto the grass, so I'm okay to continue my normal racing line. But it's at this point here that I'm recognising that the Aston Martin is squeezing and pinching me over on the left hand side of the track. Rather than try and actually still go for that gap, I just back out of it and decide to slot in behind him instead and see if I can try and basically get myself a decent run, either coming out of Piff Path, which is the next 2 turns here, or basically get a decent run out of Stavlo and see if I can potentially get a decent run through up underneath the rear wing, through Blanchimont, and try and make an overtaking manoeuvre into the bus stop chicane. Either way, both of us on the brakes at the same time, nailing the braking point for this next corner. The Aston Martin, however, either turns in or seems to lose it a little bit under braking, and obviously starts to get a little bit slidey and a little bit loose. I'm obviously recognising that, so I'm trying to give myself as much room and as much options as possible to either go around the outside of him here to take the inside for the next left-hander, or go for a switchback, which at this point I was deciding was probably going to be the best manoeuvre, especially when I recognise that he is moving towards the outside of this turn. Is going to be very, very tight for the next right-hander. So I'm trying to switch back on him now. Obviously, I realise that the closing speed is a little bit too much, so quick double the brake there to avoid making contact with him. Trying to open up this corner as much as possible. At this point, I get quite aggressively on the throttle to try and cut back underneath him and get myself the best run possible coming out through the exit of the corner. But of course, that causes the rear wheels to break traction, and as you can see, I'm into quite a hefty slide, and I had to put a decent handful of opposite lock in order to try and save it, which I do manage to do, but obviously that cost me the time and momentum and the speed, and I end up dropping back from the Aston Martin in front of us. Now, I've got a little bit of room at this point, so once again, kind of going back to the mentality of settling in, getting a decent run coming through this corner here, and then through Stavlo, and basically seeing if I can close up into the braking zone of the bus stop to try and get a decent run coming into basically the end of the first lap and into the first corner. So focusing on a good run here, not really trying to pressure the other car too much, more just kind of focusing on myself. Coming through Stavlo, getting a decent run here, just trying to pick up the slipstream of the Aston Martin in front of us. Just try and close up for the braking zone of the bus stop chicane. And just like a Rouge, obviously with the car in front of us here, I'm not going to have the downforce that I would like to have, so slight double the brake and lifting off to try and actually get myself a decent run through Blanchimont. And I could have been a little bit tighter to the inside curb. You don't actually want to touch the inside curb because that quite easily unsettles the car, and where this corner is such a high speed corner, if you unsettle it here, the likelihood of you having a very, very big off and finding the wall at quite high speed is pretty high. So just basically, yeah, well, you want to get close to it but not too close, and the run through was okay, running a little bit wide, but just trying to carry in the speed of the momentum, not as wide as the Aston Martin there in front of us. And then coming into the braking zone, he actually hits the brakes at the right point, as do I. Now the braking point, but he actually comes off the brakes for some reason momentarily, and ends up running deep into the bus stop chicane here, whereas I'm very much heavy on the brakes, as you can see. And then you can see coming into the bus stop chicane, he's actually going to run a little bit deep, catching that little dip there on the inside, which unsettles the car a little bit. But because I know he's gone deep, he's going to do one of two things. Either he's going to completely cut this second part of the chicane and rejoin the track in the much safer manner, or he's going to try and rejoin the track in and around the apex of this next left-hander. So I actually go ahead and give him racing room here on the inside to again avoid making contact, and then because I get a decent run through the exit of the corner, accelerate away, and I actually go up from 15th position up into 7th, like I said. So there are a number of things that you can do on the first lap, as you see, and obviously using the brakes a little bit earlier, kind of flashing those braking lights, trying to get the cars to slow down, sticking to your lanes through the first corner, and then it's yeah, just about managing the switching from being cautious and just settling in and being patient and tucking in behind cars, and then being a little bit aggressive and seeing if you can try and basically take any available gaps and see if you can take any available positions. Okay, so here we are with another scenario, and this is actually taken from a league race. So generally the racing here should be very, very clean. A lot of people should be taking the right approach to the first turn. And this is actually with a rolling start. We do our own rolling starts in the AOR league race that this footage is taken from. We're looking at the perspective of me in the M6, and we are starting in 7th, 8th position, around there. And basically we've just come to the end of our formation lap, and we're actually taking the our manual rolling start that we actually do. So as you can see, I'm kind of there on the brakes. I'm basically waiting for the cars in front of us to go to actually start this the actual rolling start itself, which they do so now. So now we're actually accelerating away, and obviously, as you probably guessed by now, this is actually Monza. And what you're seeing is all the cars are basically, where we're in the 2x2 formation and we add a little bit of space between each of the cars, all the cars are actually trying to basically form into a single file line and pick up the slipstream on the approach down to the first turn. And as we get closer to the braking zone for the first corner, all the cars will end up fanning and spreading out and basically trying to find a bit of space for them. Now at this point, obviously, I'm kind of looking towards the inside here. You can see there's a gap forming in front of me as well, on the inside line, which will allow me to take that and possibly gain a position or two depending on what people are doing when it comes to the braking zone. But that gap actually ends up closing up with the Ferrari actually coming and protecting his inside line here and taking that gap away from me. Now, as you can see, everyone's now pretty much committed and actually picking their lanes. We're still not quite there up at the braking point yet. The braking point is just before the 150 meter board under racing conditions. It should be basically you want to be braking around there when it actually comes to the first lap as well, just to give yourself the best chance of avoiding making contact and running into the back of people in front of you. Obviously, if you're at the front of the field, then you can brake later, but if you're at the front of the field, then you obviously need to brake a little bit earlier. Because obviously all the cars are going to concertina up, and the braking point is going to shift further back down the track and more towards the 200 meter board. So as you saw, I tapped the brakes a couple of times there, and we're doing so again here. It's the same technique that I explained in the previous scenario, where I was just trying to basically get the cars to slow down and give myself a little bit of breathing room, get them reacting to the lights, get them slowing down and making sure that they're not going to run into the back of me, but obviously holding the accelerator. At this point here, I'm now pretty much off the accelerator, fully onto the brake, and actually committing to the braking zone for the first chicane here at Monza. So we're coming in now, and as you can see, the Ferrari's got a little bit late onto the brakes and is actually kind of half having to move across and in towards the apex in order to try and avoid making contact with the Ferrari and give himself the best chance of slowing down. From the headlights down the bottom left hand side of the screen, you can see that there is a car coming up on my outside as well, and he's actually got a fair amount of room between himself and the next car in his lane, which is the yellow Ferrari. So he's going to obviously take the speed and take away that space there on my outside for this corner, and basically try and get to the inside for the second part. Now obviously I'm committed to the inside lane here, which is going to give me the outside for the next part. There's a little bit of contact as the cars in front are going 3 wide with the late braking Ferrari. So there's a little bit of contact there, but fortunately everyone comes out of that mostly unscathed. There may have been a little bit of damage pickup. There is damage on in this lobby in the league that we were racing, so there may have been a little bit of damage pickup between them, but no one's spun out of control. Now, as you've seen, I've taken the apex and the apex curve, and obviously got the Lamborghini there on the outside. I knew he was there somewhere along the line, but I wasn't entirely sure where he was. I actually go ahead and make the mistake of actually turning in a little bit more, not giving the Lamborghini enough room here on the inside. So there's a little bit of contact there between myself and the Lamborghini, but once again, nothing too major. And we both continue on our way. I don't pick up any damage. I believe the Lamborghini didn't pick up any damage. So we're basically off and away racing, coming out the first turn, and we all got through relatively cleanly just by people mostly sticking to their lanes. Obviously the red Ferrari in front of us braked a little bit late for that first turn, and obviously tried to pick the space in order to avoid basically try and minimize the contact between other cars. Ignore the sparking Mercedes up in front. That is just a graphics glitch with old replays. And then coming down into this corner, I'm not in any kind of position to threaten the car in front, so just taking it relatively casually and cautiously coming into the second chicane here. Obviously the cars in front checking up a little bit as they're all kind of slotting in one behind each other. Missed the apex of that first curb slightly, and do so again with the second. As you can see, getting a little bit sideways there, coming out through the exit. But everyone's just kind of half settling down and just trying to settle into a bit of a rhythm and a bit of a flow with the cars around. So coming into the first of the two Lesmos, coming through quite nicely, and the Ferrari actually gets a slight wiggle and ends up running out wide, which kind of half presents me with an opportunity of trying to go for the inside coming into the second Lesmo. I'm not actually going to go ahead and take that, as the Ferrari actually ends up going defensive, so what I do instead is slot in behind. I did initially half go for a look to try and fake a move, but thought better of it and thought it would be best to just actually take the second Lesmo as best as possible, because basically I'm just going to lose touch to the cars up ahead. So coming through the second corner, my run through was slightly compromised because I did that fake move, so I dropped back off the Ferrari a little bit, but we're not really under any threat to the cars behind. So I am just kind of being mindful and being cautious and just kind of wanting to settle in at this point. Go get the car through a couple of laps and then start attacking, or seeing if we can start to attack the guys in front, and basically just try and keep touch with them in the first couple of laps. Now, as you've probably seen, a couple of the cars are actually starting to run wide into the entry of Ascari. Again, much better run through. The Ferrari there, as you can see, goes and runs over the curb on the exit. Again, a much better run through here, because my line was that much better. See the car bouncing and sliding, and then the Ferrari at the very front of this train, as you can probably see there, has got his brake lights on. He's actually gone and picked up a slowdown penalty, so he's trying to move out the way of everyone here. Obviously people are trying to pick up the slipstream where they can, but obviously recognise that the car is actually slowing, so they move out of the slipstream. I'm trying to stay in the slipstream of the Ferrari immediately in front of me, and then he actually goes and taps the brakes, and at that point I basically recognise that he also got a slowdown penalty because of the him running wide through the mid part of Ascari. So I've got the run and the momentum on the two slowing Ferraris here. Obviously I've got ahead and past one, but coming into the braking zone I'm actually coming up alongside this Ferrari here, so obviously I'm going to be a little bit aggressive and see if I can actually take the position away down the inside coming into the braking zone here for the final turn, the Parabolica. Now obviously now I'm a braking point and come into the corner, and the Ferrari that was there on my outside is actually going and doing a rather nice switchback. As I've gone and run a little bit deep here, he's actually gone and picked up the throttle way earlier and has cut back underneath me, and then continuing on through the replay, you can see there basically the managing and controlling the aggression in that first lap, trying to avoid contact where I can. There was one or two taps of contact where people slightly misjudged things, and I didn't quite realise that the Lamborghini was quite that far up my inside. I was kind of half trying to pinch it a little bit through the second apex curve, but because he was there fully alongside me, we ended up making contact. But the rest of the lap was relatively clean, and obviously it's more just controlled aggression, just letting the flow of the basically that first lap just play out, and kind of reacting to that, being calculated with the aggressive moves when to try and actually overtake. Don't force anything when it comes to the first lap, and basically just purely focus on actually trying to survive. So I think that's going to pretty much conclude it for this episode. Essentially, just as a bit of a roundup, use the brakes a little bit before the braking zone. Just flash the rear lights, flash the braking lights, sorry, to try and get the cars behind you slowing down early as well, to make sure that they don't come into the back of you. Try and obviously use as much of situational awareness features as possible in order to try and basically give yourself as much information as to any cars that are coming up and approaching you at relatively high speed. If you can see that they're going to go barreling down the inside, don't turn in. Likewise, if you're there on the outside and you've got room on the inside and they're coming straight for you on the outside and not moving to the inside, go ahead and move across to the right hand side. Obviously make sure that you still slow down enough for the corner, but you can, if you are watching your mirrors a little bit, you can actually move out the way of rammers, even though sometimes you are just going to be unlucky and a rammer is just going to do everything in their power to potentially hit you. But yeah, be cautious with that first lap. Just let it flow, and don't force any of the overtaking maneuvers. Obviously pick up any when you can. Be calculated when you're going to try and be a little bit aggressive and try and force an overtaking maneuver. But the main focus should purely just be surviving that first lap. And then once things have calmed down a little bit and spread out a little bit more, that's when you can start going on the attack and seeing if you can actually start making up a lot more places. Like I said, and many other people, and the old famous saying goes, you can't win on the first lap, but you certainly can lose it. So yeah, just be cautious and be mindful of everyone else around you. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching the episode, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below and try and get back to you as soon as possible. But otherwise, thanks very much for watching the episode. Consider subscribing to the channel, and hopefully I shall see you in the next one. But in the meantime, have fun and take care.